So, we've been talking for multiple weeks about the dark forces underneath what's going on in the world. Tonight, I want to kind of zero in on how that war is going. And if we have the time, we will talk about how it's going to end, which you know how it's going to end, but we'll see what the scripture says a little bit about that. 2 Peter chapter 2 and verse 4. For if God spared not the angels that sinned, but cast them down to hell, we're talking about a war. There's a war, actually multiple battles going on in this war. For if God spared not the angels that sinned, but cast them down to hell, and delivered them into chains of darkness, to be reserved unto judgment, and spared not the old world, but saved Noah, the eighth person, a preacher of righteousness, bringing in the flood upon the world of the ungodly. And much more. We've looked at this passage multiple times before. I found this interesting. Lifeway Research came out with this. It was today, was the first I've seen of it. And it says, in churches there is fear growing. I believe there is a growing sense of fear within our congregation, is what it was prefaced with. And here's the statistics they found. 69% there on the left agree with the statement, the future of our nation and the world is uncertain. They're afraid of it. On the right side, 63%, the future of Christianity in our nation and the world causes them fear. Now, I bring this up because, to me, how do you be a Christian and it not be 100%? You're here tonight and you continue to come to this study because you want to know the way things are shaping up. But that's not true, and that's, I guess, maybe the crux of why I'm bringing it up. Most of Christianity doesn't know the stuff that we're talking about. And a big chunk of the church doesn't care to know. They're just afraid. I was surprised several decades ago when they came out with the statistics, the number of minutes in a day the average preacher prays. And it was like not even a minute a day. I determined then to begin to analyze my prayer life and how much time I spend in prayer every day, and have increased it over the years. If you don't pray every day, you just don't have the power you need, the perspective and understanding you need for the daily things that come up. And so if God knows everything, and He knows my thoughts, the question comes up, well, why do I need to bother to pray? Well, you don't need to bother to pray, but the one thing we discovered about God is that He wants the interaction with His children.
He created us for that reason.
He wants you to pray, and prayer is two-way. And I've told you before that you need to spend a whole lot more time reading the Bible, which is hearing from God, right? It's two-way. There are things you say to God, but how do you hear from God? Well, you hear from God by the Holy Spirit. Sometimes says things in your spirit, yes, but the most trustworthy way, the way you know it's God, is when you're reading the Bible. When you're reading the Bible, you know that's God. So you need to spend more time listening to Him than He needs to listen to you. And we need to hear from Him. I've prayed about some lost causes and continue to pray for some lost causes. And how long do you continue to do that? Well, Jesus said, we need to continue to bend His ear. But I've had the experience many times of not praying, bringing it to an end, no longer praying about something I've prayed for 1,000 times and 1,000 days. And finally, for whatever reason, I just don't. And a year later, the answer to prayer will come. long after I stopped praying. Anyway, that's extra. So I just thought that was interesting and sad that it's not 100% of people who are concerned about the future of the world and the future of Christianity in the world. Christianity is in a tough spot. I would think it's doom for the church if it wasn't for what Jesus said. He said that the gates of hell would not prevail against it. Most Christians are the Scarlett O'Hare type Christians. You know what that is, right? I can't think about that today. After all, tomorrow's another day. What? Yeah. Yeah. And of course, that affects all of us, and we have to shake it off, and we have to move beyond being lukewarm. Otherwise, we're not any different. I mean, we are all affected by the lukewarmness. So, let's talk about these three major pivotal events that we've been talking about that explain why the world is as bad as it is. They explain why we are where we are today. Genesis chapter 3, the fall of humanity. All three of these events are epic events. There's lots of little or other things go on in the world that has shaped us to be where we are, but these are the seminal or pivotal events. The fall of man explains the human heart. But then Genesis chapter 6, the fall of the angels, those fallen angels coming down, having relations with women, and the net result of that are what's called the Nephilim, or they are giants. And we're going to talk about that tonight. And then in Genesis chapter 10, we've talked for several weeks about the Tower of Babel. And this was the moment at which God finally got fed up, and he essentially separated people into the different nations and divorced them. And the nations are right now in a divorced state from God. And they are under different authority than they were before that. And it's in Genesis chapter 10 that the Tower of Babel happened. And then the very next thing happens is God turns to Abraham, and he selects Abraham to bring out of him by a miraculous birth. Sarah was well beyond childbirth age, and the miraculous birth, out of that comes the Messiah, Israel, and ultimately the Messiah. Much of the rest of the Old Testament, about everything else you read in the Old Testament, has in some form or fashion to do with God dealing with these Nephilim bloodlines. You look at the Exodus, when Israel came into Israel. We haven't got time to go into it now. We've talked about it much in the past. But God had Israel focus on those giant clans and eradicate them, because they were the threat, the primary threat. And they had to be, and this is the reason why, if you don't go a step deeper, you don't understand this. People know about the Old Testament. God told Israel, kill or drive out every man, woman, and child. Okay, that sounds a little harsh, unless you understand what threat they were. That threat had to be eliminated. And everywhere Israel did not kill or drive out every man, woman, and child, it came back to bite them. In fact, if you look at Israel today, the West Bank, and those are places where they did not deal with the Nephilim, the giant clans. It's kind of eerie how you can overlay what's going on in Israel today with what they did not deal with the way God said to. So there's that. I ran across something fascinating that I wanted to share with you. We've talked about this a lot, and it's a big deal. All of the false gods of the world, Zeus and Hercules and all of that, we've talked about how those have roots in actual events or people, or Nephilim. So these Nephilim had offspring, and the offspring sometimes, well, they're described in Greek mythology sometimes as a half horse and a half man, or some kind of a thing like that. And you've heard me say that the giants in Genesis 6, the word gigantus, they were giants, but more accurately, they were freaks. It wasn't right. what was going on wasn't physiologically right. So the Titans, you've heard about the Titans, okay? So this is out of Wikipedia. I want to take it from a secular source, not from a Christian source. I want you to see this. The Titans were the former gods. Okay, now I want you to see how this is an overlay of what we actually had happen with Genesis 6 and so forth. There were the Nephilim. They fell. The giants resulted. Okay, so the Titans were the former gods, the generation of gods preceding the Olympians. They were overthrown as part of the Greek succession myth, which tells how Cronus seized power from his father Uranus and ruled the cosmos with his fellow Titans before being in turn defeated and replaced as the ruling pantheon of gods by Zeus and the Olympians in the 10-year war called Titanomachy, however you want to pronounce that. As a result of this war, the vanquished or defeated Titans were banished from the upper world and held, now watch this, and held imprisoned under guard in Tartarus. Although apparently some Titans were allowed to remain free. Do you begin to see? For if God spared not the angels that sinned, but cast them down, and the only place in the New Testament where the word Tartarus is used, it's translated as hell, is right here. It's the only place. And delivered them into the chains of darkness to be reserved unto judgment, and spared not the old world, but saved Noah in the eighth person, a preacher of righteousness, bringing the flood upon the world of the ungodly. So, again, what you have is the encapsulated simple truth in the Bible, whereas you've got these Greek myths and other myths that take it to the most absurd and ridiculous and obscene even. If you read about those Greek gods, they were creepy, obscene. That occurred in the flood. And Tartarus, if you can envision, in the heart of the earth is hell, right? So there is a solitary confinement section that is Tartarus, if you will. That place in hell is what it is, but Tartarus is just for these fallen angels. And I find it fascinating that in the Greek mythology, some of them were allowed to still be up and some of them were in chains of darkness. So we have demons today, right? There are demons. So my point is, the simple truth of the Bible, these were real events underneath of it that the pagan world, without the direction of God, took to ridiculous extremes. But I find it fascinating that you can find the truth if you're looking, just like what we're looking at right now. So I want to give you 3 dots that will form a picture. You know how you connect up the dots and it fit? Well, that's what we're going to kind of do tonight in a way. 3 different dots. And remember, if you want to understand the Bible, this is critical. Hebrew, or God's method of prophecy, is not like the Western concept of prophecy. In Western prophecy, someone makes a prediction, time goes along, and it's fulfilled. Okay, that's true. That's what prophecy is. But when God does it, God is far more elegant than that. Far more beautiful in the way he does prophecy. He has a prophet who will make a prophecy, or he will have it written down as a prophecy, and time will go along and eventually it'll be fulfilled. But the elegantness of it, is that a word, elegantness? The elegant layer of this is beyond. So, you know about Bethlehem, for example. Bethlehem was a town named House of Bread. That's what Bethlehem means. Time goes along. The Messiah is born where? In the house of bread. He grows up and he is the bread of life. So this is the kind of elegance to God's way of prophecy. So we're going to connect up 3 different dots that you may have heard this, but I doubt it. And it has to do with some of the things we've been talking about. In Genesis chapter 3, this is the first dot. Watch what God says. And I will put enmity between thee, talking to the serpent, Satan, and the woman, and between thy seed and her seed. Okay, so there's the seed of Eve, that would be all of humanity, ultimately the Messiah. The seed that he's talking about here is Jesus. There's going to be an enmity between the seed of Eve and the seed of Satan. Satan has a seed. We'll talk more about that. Notice what it says. It shall bruise thy head. That's the place. We're going to talk about in detail that place. It shall bruise thy head. Okay? Satan's head. If you want to kill a thing, where do you deal with it? If you want to deal with it, deal with the head, kill the head. It shall, it being Jesus, it shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel. When Jesus was nailed to the cross, it was his heel along with his hands, but the nail was literally driven through his heel, through that tendon behind the ankle that is strong enough to hold someone up. So just picture that. That's dot number 1. Satan's seed and the seed of the woman. That's a grand picture that God paints right at the beginning of all this. That becomes a prophecy that will be fulfilled, right? Jesus is going to die on the cross. Satan is ultimately going to be bruised on his head. Dot number 2. Fast forward to David and Goliath. Is there anybody who's not heard about David and Goliath? Everybody knows about David and Goliath. It's a classic. Everybody who comes through Sunday school knows about. I mean, it's great. It's a wonderful thing to have the kids reenact, and it's a wonderful thing for us to think. And it's a powerful story. You've got the 2 forces. Goliath is Satan. David is Jesus, literally. And I'll show you how that God has put that together in ways that I would never have thought of either. So Goliath was what? A giant. He was either a Nephilim, or more likely he was the next descendant from a Nephilim clan. Okay, so he had Nephilim blood in him. When David gets done killing, so picture this. Goliath comes and defies not just the army of Israel, but he defies God. That's what David can't take. He defies God and blasphemes the God of Israel for over 30 days. David comes along bringing cheese and bread to his brothers, and he sees this giant come out and do this thing. And nobody does anything about it. David can't take it. He has such a heart for God already that he can't take this. And so we know how the story goes. He says, I'll kill him. I'll kill him. And word comes to Saul, and Saul says, bring me the kid. And David says, listen, it's no big deal. I caught a lion by the hair of his chinny chin, and I killed him. I took a bear who had stolen one of the flock, and it killed him. A bear. Did you ever try to kill a bear? Me neither, and I don't ever intend to try. Because I'm pretty sure who would win that battle.
You better be fully inspired
Yeah,
by God.
yeah, not David. And so David does not take shield and sword. Saul says, okay, take a shot at it. Here's my stuff, the best stuff in Israel. David says, I can't use that stuff. I haven't practiced with it. So he takes his sling, and as he's coming, he says to the giant, you come to me in the name of your gods, blaspheming my God. I come to you in the name of my God. And today I'm going to feed you to the birds. I'm going to cut your head off. Now, he doesn't have a sword. All he has is a sling. As he's coming at this giant, he reaches down and grabs 5 stones, puts one of them in the sling and the other 4 in his pouch. Okay? We all know the reason for that, because Goliath had 4 brothers. Okay? David does not just intend to kill Goliath. He figures that his 4 brothers are not going to be happy about this as well. He's going to have to kill all of them. He's going to do it with a sling. This guy is a good shot, and he's got confidence in what he says. And he didn't kill a giant with a sling. All he did was stun him. Well, how did he kill him? He took the giant's sword and cut his head off. Okay, that's the second data point that I want us to see. There's a fascinating little aside. A rabbinic targum, that's a commentary. So this is not scripture. This is just an interesting Jewish rabbi commentary. They're sages about Orpah, and Goliath. So Orpah and Ruth were the daughters-in-law of Naomi. Okay, Orpah and Ruth. You remember? Their husbands die, and Naomi says, I haven't got a husband for you. Go back to Moab and find a husband. Ruth says, no. Wherever you go, I'll go with you. Your God will be my God. And that's a big deal. Orpah, on the other hand, goes back. Now, here's where the rabbinic targum or commentary comes in. According to the rabbis, Orpah was, there's different reasons for why it happened, but she went back to Moab, which was a godless nation. She had learned a little about the God of Israel from living in that home. She goes back and turns out to be so promiscuous that she's even rejected by the Moabites. Has to leave Moab, and she goes and lives with the Philistines. Has 5 children. One of them named Goliath. Okay, now that's not the Bible, but it's a fairly interesting layer added to this dot that we're talking about. You've got David, who is a type of Christ, and Goliath, who is an enemy of God, a representative of Satan. That's the clash. That's the war. Dot number 3 is the cross. The crucifixion of Jesus took place at a place called Golgotha. And there's great debate about it, but there are some who say that this is a variation of the word Goliath. Goliath of Gath. Goliath of Gath is Golgotha. It is undoubtedly in the New Testament, it is called Calvary or Golgotha, and it is called the place of the skull. He was crucified at the place. That's an interesting, the place of whose skull? I suggest to you, based on the picture that's forming for us, that there's more to it than that. So David, you know what that means in the Hebrew? David means beloved. Jesus was the beloved Son of God, God's beloved Son. What a wonderful accident.
Sure.
Do you see how elegant God is in the way that he does stuff? So I wanted you to see this. It's kind of gross, but we've been talking a lot about giants and so forth. So here's a artist's rendition of what it looked like. He cut his head off, and he holds it up, and he puts the fear in all of the Philistines. What I want you to notice is the size. Here's another picture that kind of gives you an idea of the size. So depending on how the measurements were in the Old Testament, how tall he is, about 9 feet tall. Okay? we don't actually know. It could have been more than that, it could have been less. 9 feet would be enough. But I did a little comparison. The average spear was 6 feet. If this guy, and 9 feet would have been twice as tall as the average person. He would, a giant of 9 feet tall. But it might have been more than that if a spear was 6 feet in that day, in the medieval world, in the old world, then if you just double that, that puts him at 12 feet. And I would suggest that that's more likely what he actually was, 12 feet. Now, the average human head weighs 10 pounds. If you double that, it would have been 20 pounds. So 20 pounds, though, that's almost half a feed sack. At any rate, you get the difference in size. And so what happens to this head? Anybody know what happens to this head? Oh, I'll show you. So this is Israel. This is a very old picture of something called the place of the skull. Not skulls, the place of the skull.
Because it resembled a skull.
There's that, and that's why the site was picked, but there's more to it. In 1 Samuel 17:5, in this account, here's what we find about Goliath. And he had a helmet of brass. Now, I want to show you something about brass, if you don't already remember it. He had a helmet that was brass. He had a coat of mail that weighed, and the coat was 5,000 shekels of brass. And the greaves of brass, in other words, his shin coverings on his legs, was brass. And his chest plate was brass. The only thing that was not brass was the spearhead. That was iron. Okay? But this guy really had a thing for brass. Jump over to the book of Revelation, chapter 1, verse 15. John sees Jesus, and his feet like unto fine brass, as if they burned in a furnace. In the Old Testament tabernacle, the metals and the materials said things. They spoke prophetically. So where they burned the sacrifice, it was called a brazen or bronze altar. It was the place of judgment. Right? That's why John sees Jesus as if he had stood in the fire. He was the sacrifice who stood in the place of judgment. First Samuel 17, the story kind of comes to a conclusion in verse 54. And David took the head of the Philistine and brought it to Jerusalem. But he put the armor in his tent. That's very controversial. What that means is interesting to debate. But there is no debate. He took the head of the Philistines and brought it to Jerusalem. Tradition, rabbinic opinion, is that he buried it there. So Jesus was crucified at the place of the skull. What do you suppose the chances are, if you're going to be a betting Baptist, that it was right here somewhere? You remember the seed of the serpent and the seed of the woman, he's going to bruise his head. Where did that take place? That took place wherever he was crucified. If this was not the spot, wherever the spot was that he was crucified, that's where he beat the devil. So whether physically, at least symbolically and prophetically, that was fulfilled. Now we know Paul said that if the devil, if Satan had known what God was up to, he'd never had Christ killed. But he was tricked. Any of you remember that Superman movie? You know, the movie that made you believe a man could fly? I think it was the second one, where these three other beings came, and because they were from Krypton, they also had superpowers on Earth. And they wind up at the place of solitude that Superman had. I guess in the North Pole. And he had a phone booth. And they believed that if they could put him in that phone booth, make him stay in there and turn it on, that he would be turned into a normal human being. Only he flipped it around and it was reversed and it turned them into normal human beings. Well, that's just kind of a picture in my mind of what Jesus did to Satan on the cross. Satan thought he had the upper hand. He was beaten by his own plan. Ephesians 2:15, Paul said, having abolished in his flesh, Jesus in his flesh, the enmity, even the law of commandments contained in ordinances, for to make in himself of twain one new man, so making peace, and that he might reconcile both unto God in one body by the cross, having slain the enmity thereby, and came and preached peace to you which were far off, and to them that were nigh. A pivotal passage that we've been looking at in our prophetic study is 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. We have a description here of the rapture of the church and the tribulation and what the devil is going to be like. Paul said, don't sweat it. You haven't been left behind. That's why he wrote the whole thing. He said in verse 3, let no man deceive you by any means, for that day shall not come except there come a falling away first. That's the apostasy of the church. That's the lukewarm Laodicean era that we were talking about earlier. We're seeing that accelerate right now. Amen. And that man of sin be revealed, the son of perdition, the seed of the serpent, who opposeth and exalteth himself above all that is called God, or that is worshipped, so that he, as God, sitteth in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. The guy is insane. He's really smart, but he's insane. So, all I can do is introduce this to you. Next week we will talk about how Satan is going to imitate in a bunch of different ways everything about God during this thing that's coming. The current events that we're witnessing are a threefold system designed to move humanity away from God's plan, driven by the dark forces of man, the man of sin, the Antichrist, and his replacement kingdom. So there's three parts to what the devil's shaping up right now: the government, the economy, and religion. And so he is the Antichrist, not just that he opposes God, but that he's in the process of replacing God. Yep. See, that's what we saw in Genesis 3, Genesis 6, and Genesis 10. In all three of those events, they were satanic attempts to replace God in the thinking and the mind of humanity. This is what he's going to try to do in the 7-year tribulation. And so we'll talk about how Satan is an imitator, a copycat, an impersonator, but we'll have to do it next week because it is 8 o'clock.